Okay, hello, good afternoon. We are very, very glad today to host in our lecture series George Jeronimidis. He's an expert in biomimetics, and his work has been very inspiring in many of the projects that we have developed here at Iaac the last years, as well as his feedback when he had the opportunity to be here again, like 6 months ago, has been as well very valuable. And it's glad to host him today for an open public lecture. You should take advantage of him. You should shoot him with questions. Not too much. We don't want to tire him so much. But just for the ones that they don't know, George Jeronimidis, he's a professor in composite materials as well in the University of Reading, and he's the director of the, let me see exactly, the Center of Biomimetics. He became in 2009 the co-director of the MTech program, which is the Emerging Technologies and Design program at the AA in London. He obtained his PhD at the University of Rome and moved to the University of Reading in 1970s. So his research and work cover the design of composite fiber structures in biology, engineering and architecture, so that to achieve high levels of functional integration. He has published extensively, and he has worked extensively in the fields of biomechanics, biomimetics, wood science, composite mechanics, smart materials and structures, and bio-inspired systems in engineering and architecture. He is as well currently on the editorial board of the new international journal Virtual and Physical Prototyping, Wood Science and Technology, and Biomimetics and Bioinspiration. That was long. And in 2009 he was elected president of Biocon International, which is a European network for the promotion of biomimetics in relevant sectors: engineering, architecture, built environment, material and sensors. So he is like an interesting research and practice reference in everything related with biology, biomimetics, and how this discipline could give us answers, how we can extract logics and understand logics that we could apply in architecture for achieve efficiency. And we are very glad to have you here with us. Thank you very much for being here. And
thank you very much for the kind.
No, they can't.
They can't. Can you hear me now? Okay, can you hear me if I'm sitting or staying a little bit further away from the... Everybody okay?
We're going to see the other microphone if you miss. Do you prefer?
Yeah, probably.
Switch it on, wait for 3 seconds.
Okay, can you hear me now? Yeah, that's fine, thank you. Well, it's interesting. I mean, first of all, thank you for the introduction and thank you for the invitation. I was here 6 months ago and I found this place incredibly interesting because there are a lot of things happening in the teaching and some of the projects which are really close to my interests as well as close to what we do at the AA in London. So possibilities of collaborations certainly are on the cards. There is also an interesting difference in cultures, because if I were in London, I would start my talk by saying good evening, whereas in fact here we say good afternoon. Okay, your afternoon stretches a lot further away than our afternoon. So anyway, I'm really delighted to be here. And what I want to do is a bit of an overview of biomimetics, if I can get this thing started. Sorry?
Yeah, it's open. It's not required, it's open.
Open what? Open.
Già qui.
Ah, da qui. Okay, and then sì, questo so. Okay, so the title, I mean, because it's a public lecture, I gave something which was much more specific as a lecture 6 months ago. So this time I tried to broaden the field a little bit more, and it's really the idea of biometics and bioinspiration. And smart solutions, to me, really the smartest of nature is really one of the most fascinating things, and certainly coming from an engineering background, when I started talking to people and colleagues in biology, really, you can only look with fascination in the first place at all these amazing things which happen in the natural systems. And when I say for functional architecture, I'm not necessarily going to give you answers. There are a few. Biomimetics is an evolving field, and things are happening very quickly. If I had to give the same lecture 15 years ago, I would have covered the whole field of biomimetics in possibly 2 lectures. Now, if I look back at what I'm doing and how much has happened, it will take me 20 to 30 lectures to cover what has happened since. So it's growing incredibly quickly in a variety of different fields. Architecture is a very important one. So although I do not profess to give you answers, what I want to try to do is to give you an idea of how you should be thinking about biology in relation to architecture. So I hope that this is going to be of interest to you. And what I've got down here are sort of things I've been working with in a variety of different projects. Crickets, and mainly for sensing functions, the bone for structural purpose. Trees, I have a fascination with plants. And in fact, there is an argument to me that says that really, if one wants to look at architecture in relation to biology, or biology in relation to architecture, the most important living organism that you should be looking for are plants, because plants share essentially a lot of characteristics with buildings. And the main characteristic that they share with buildings is that they cannot move away from danger, they cannot move away from changes in the environment. A fish, a shark can swim away, a cricket can fly off, okay, a human being can walk somewhere else. A building is rooted where it is, and so is a plant. So whatever the environment is going to throw in terms of survivability, these organisms had to really adapt themselves and invent, if you like, it's not the right word, but develop, evolutionary speaking, tricks, mechanisms to increase the functionality to be able to survive. And that, to me, is one of the important things. So again, for some of you, I may be covering ground that already is known, but I'm not going to spend too much time on that. I really want to cover a few technological solutions inspired by biology, not because they're necessarily important in terms of architecture, but because I think they show the way in which to approach the topic of biomimetics, okay? And then some further example of technology transfer and some conclusions. As I said, 45 minutes is really pushing. So I'll do my best. So the first question, and this is something we asked ourselves when we started working in this area, was what is biomimetics? Nowadays, with the growth of the topic, there are possibly half a dozen, if not more, definitions. Everyone has got his own idea of what biomimetics is, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. To me, it still remains something that my biological colleague at Reading came up with one day, and he says, really, what we are trying to do really is to abstract good design from nature. And good design really covers a very broad spectrum of things. But the important word is the abstraction, okay? We can use biology as biology, okay? And there are numerous examples of doing that. In other words, we exploit the capacity of biological systems for our own purposes. Here, what we're trying to do with biomimetics is not replace biology, but what we're trying to do is to understand what are the mechanisms, what are the solutions that biology has been obliged to develop over evolutionary times, and then to ask ourselves the question, is there something there that we can use for our own purpose? It may be in architecture, it may be in engineering, it may be in robotics, it may be in chemical engineering, it may be in medicine, whatever not. The fields are huge, and I will show some of those later on. The terminology also matters. The Anglo-Saxon word for the discipline is biomimetics, is really something which came from the United States, okay? Many people do not like the word biomimetics because the mimesis aspect they interpret as copying, where in fact as we said, is not copying but is abstracting. So they started using the word bio-inspired, which is just as effective. And then in the German-speaking world, okay, the same concept was developed over a number of years, and there it was the combination of the two words biologie and technique, which ended up by being contracted into bionic. Unfortunately, if you talk about bionics in English, you mean something completely different. Bionics is associated with the interface between biology and electronics, okay? And unfortunately, language has got its own problems, okay? All I wanted to say here is that all these things are perfectly equivalent to each other. It's the same idea. In other words, what can we learn? Can we understand it? Can we translate it and transfer it in our own word? Again, looking at biology is something that mankind has always done, okay? And there are a number of examples in the arts, in architecture, in design of what I call form and shape biometics. In other words, the beauty of the shape. This is obviously what we perceive in the first instance. We look at something, our eyes are the first sense which reacts to what we see. And there are, without any question, a lot of absolutely beautiful things which have got a function but not necessarily the one I'm interested in. So it's not that I want to dismiss it. All I'm saying is that it's a category of biomimetics, or a subcategory of biomimetics, if you like, which is not the one I want to cover in this talk. And the examples of that, okay, you can see in the figurative arts, you can see plants, trees, animals, all over the place. So there are beautiful objects. We can assign some attributes to these things in a different context from the biological one, okay, and then we can, in the limit, end up by doing things like that, which is the, these are the supporting columns, so to speak, columns of the airport in Stuttgart, and their function structurally is purely to transmit the loads from the roof down to the ground. Something which normally we would have done with a normal straight column. Okay, from a structural point of view, this thing, okay, is really a column. It's been given the shape of a tree, of the branching structure of a tree, for purely aesthetical reasons, but the connection between the tree and the structure is really non-existent at all, other than in the shape, okay, not in the function. A tree does not function like that, okay? So, again, nothing wrong with that, but it's not the sort of things which are, to my mind, more interesting. More interesting is what I've come to define as functional biomimetics. In other words, this time, what I'm interested in is to capture the functional attributes of living organisms, not just the aesthetical one. If the aesthetical ones come out of the process, so much the better, okay? But it's really the functionality of living organisms and then translate them into innovative technological solutions. And as I said, nowadays the number of these solutions is increasing all the time. Not all of them have necessarily reached maturity or the marketplace, but there are a lot of research groups all over the world pushing and pushing. So one needs, in order to approach biomimetics, one needs somewhat to understand a bit of biology as well, and you really need to go back and look at what you may call are the design drivers of natural design. Well, the first design driver is the environment itself. You've got physical, chemical environments, and more importantly, you've got physical, chemical environments which are changing, okay? That's the important thing. And again, the connection between buildings, if you like, and biology is very obvious. We have the same problem. A building has got the same kind of thing. And then you've got the energy requirements for life, what you may call survival. These are the design drivers. Everything which has happened in biology, okay, has been determined by having to deal with these two things. So the question is, what kind of solutions has biology come up with in order to meet the requirements, if you like, which come from there? Well, there are a number of things, natural processes, if you like. You got all the issue of adaptation, evolution, natural selection, And again, I don't want to go into the details of that, but to me the adaptation, which is the result, if you like, of evolution, natural selection, is one of the most important things. Okay, it is really the fact that as the environment changes, the organism can adapt, which makes it surviving. Okay, so survival is really very closely related to adaptation. The adaptation, as I said, comes from a number of different processes: genetic variability, the genotypes, and more importantly, and often forgotten, people sometimes get obsessed with the genetics, and they forgot about the phenotypes. In many ways, in order to see what happens in response to changes in the environment, okay, is more important looking at phenotypes rather than genotypes. The phenotypes is really simply the genotype plus the interaction with the environment. Okay, so if you don't have that, okay, the genotype is only part of the answer. The phenotypes, and an example of phenotypes, if you take, just to go back to trees for a moment, if you take clones of the same tree species, okay, and you put them and plant them, okay, in a plantation or in a park or whatever you like, and you go back 10 years later and look at the shape of the trees. Remember, these are genetically identical individuals, okay? So in theory, the answer should be the same. Of course, they've got, every single one has got a different shape, okay? This is a phenotypic response. In other words, every tree has got a slightly different environment from the neighbor, even if the neighbor is only 3 meters away, and the shape of the tree is a reflection of the change in the environment between here and there. The amount of light that it perceives, the amount of nutrients, the wind effects or whatever not, can be very different from one point to the next, and the tree adapts to that. So even though you have the same genetic information, you don't have necessarily the same answer. And that's why sometimes, as I said, looking at phenotypes or phenotypic responses is more interesting than looking at genotypic ones. So the result of all this stuff is to come up with these smart adaptive biological systems. That is, if you like, where the information is, and then is the question how we can start looking at that. And this is, as I said, is an ongoing thing, growing all the time. This is from an article in The Economist in Technology Quarterly in 2005. This is almost 10 years ago. Okay, you can imagine. In those days, this was just at the beginning, and now a lot of these things happen. So the process is ongoing in a variety of different things. And I think it's important, before I go any further, to not only go back to the biology, as I said before, but also to try to give a kind of a plan of action, if you like. How do you do biomimetics, so to speak? Okay, how do you tackle this thing? And really, the starting point has got to be the biology. This is where the information is, okay? And that means automatically that if you do not have the knowledge, you've got to go and find it somewhere else. And all the most effective groups working in biometics have always had combination of people working in biology, material science, engineering, architecture, computers, computational aspects, mathematics, physics, whatever you like. If you don't have the biologist, you are missing some of the information, okay? I mean, there is a lot of information out there. You can go and read it in books. It's not quite the same thing as having someone with a deep knowledge to be able to point you in the right direction. So this is an example of some work was done at the University of Freiburg, okay? There are people working in plants normally, and they took a giant reed, and they were interested in seeing if there was something interesting. So the first thing they did was to look at the biological system, the structure, the morphology, the mechanical properties, physical properties, the way it was growing, etc., etc. Then they started, and so this is the biomechanics, functional morphology, anatomy. Notice that in all these, there is no genetics, okay? You don't need genetics to look at what biology has given you as an answer, okay? You can look it under your own eye, with your own eyes, and a few simple experiments. So then you understand the principles, okay, and then you abstract the principles. And this is a difficult step because there is a tendency in a lot of areas of remaining anchored and rooted to the biological system for too long, so that the transition between the biological sort of template and the application that you want to develop struggles, because you are trying effectively to copy the biological system, and this is completely different. The materials are different, the scale may be different, the processes, the fabrication, everything is going to be different. To replicate all that is a different kind of challenge. So the abstraction aspect, at some point, and say, look, the biology stops here, from now on I go into something else, is an important one, but sometimes a very difficult one to make. And then you go into the technical implementation, which means choosing your scale, your material system, your fabrication process, your collaborators, whatever you like. So that's how things should happen. And it's not limited to engineering, okay? It's engineering in this case because this is a structural component, but it could be architecture, it could be anything else you like. Excuse me. So this is how one should proceed. And there are a few examples of that, what I call the right kind of biomimetics, okay, which is, for example, and we know that there are a few buildings, some of them really sort of inspired by termite nest, others pseudo-inspired. There is a lot of that, unfortunately, as well, which is cosmetic rather than true. But there is no question that if you look at termite nest, this is a very interesting structure. Okay, it's an interesting structure. For one thing, for me, is that the material in this system doesn't matter at all, or very little. Okay, you can't have it any simpler than mud in terms of a material for building something. And yet, the colony of termites is capable of extracting a lot of functionality out of the thing, and is doing it by building a set of canals and connections inside, and these are used to regulate the internal environment, control humidity, control the temperature, control gaseous exchanges, and whatever not. So it's not surprising that there are a few groups working in trying to understand a bit more, but to understand a bit more really means integrating the whole knowledge. You can't limit yourself to just looking at one part of it, because you're not going to get the answer. So this kind of multidisciplinary approach is also incredibly important. Of course, nowadays, with computational techniques that we have available, we could start looking at the flow of gases inside a very complex set of canal systems, which years ago it was just impossible. And again, just to give you again examples of how to think about, okay, this is probably the first real example of what you may call functional modern biomimetics, and it comes from plants. A lot of things actually do come from plants, not surprisingly, because they are in many ways simpler organisms. They're animals, they don't have a nervous system, which means that the physical material properties, the smartness comes from the assembly of things rather than from a higher intelligence. And plants have got a problem being rooted on the ground, of course. If they want to disperse their genetic information, which they do via the seeds, they need to get the seeds further away from the parent plant. So plants have invented over evolutionary times all sorts of tricks to propagate the seeds. And one of the tricks is to have the seeds covered with little hooks. You can see this is a weed which grows everywhere. And the function of the hook is very simple. When you got an animal going to touch the plant or try to eat the plant, the function of the hooks is simply to make sure that the seed gets attached to the fur or to the feathers of the animal, and then the animal will run away and the seed will drop off somewhere else and it will germinate. Okay, so it's purely a mechanism for dispersing genetic information. So that's the biology. Okay, do you know what the technology which comes out of here is? Velcro. Velcro is indeed simply the result of the observation by de Mestral in 1948. That's the date of his patent. And you can see it on the right, okay? Obviously, it doesn't look like the seed at all. okay, which is important as well, is not a copy of the seed. It's simply trying to extract the principles. The principle of the seed is very simple. You want to have hooks on the one side, that's the plant side, and then you want to have a fur or a feather on the other side, which is the animal side. Okay, well, this is the plant side, and this is the animal side, combined together in a textile structure. Now, what is interesting about Velcro is the fact that the jump or the transition from the observation of the biological system to the implementation of the technical system was done very quickly. And the reason why it was done very quickly is simply because, by luck, Demestral was working in the textile industry. So the moment he got the idea, he realized that the manufacturing side and the fabrication side was something that the textile industry in which he was working could deal with very, very quickly. Unfortunately, that step is not always as quick as that. In other cases, okay, one has to invest years of development, funding, struggling to try to get the thing from a research context into an application context. And perhaps the example which illustrates that is this one, which is comparatively recent. And I know very well the people who did the work at the University of Bonn, botanists again, looked at the Lotus Leaf, not because it's the only one, all leaves, most leaves do that anyway. And the idea that they had at the time was nothing to do with inventing a new technology, it was to do with understanding how plants manage to keep the surface of the leaves clean as far as possible. And that is important, of course, because the leaf is where the solar collectors, if you like, are. This is where light is converted, energy is captured and converted. If you start having problems with contamination of the surface, then you lose efficiency. And that's something which, again, in a generic aspect of trying to optimize the use of energy, plants do not want to do. So over evolutionary times, plants have simply evolved mechanisms for making sure that the leaf could be kept clean as easily as possible, given the fact that they cannot clean it themselves. So the people who studied that were interested, as I said, in what are other mechanisms. And again, I don't know, some of you may know about the details of the Lotus effect. To me, is one of these other things which is fascinating, because the answer very often is very, very simple. Very simple in the sense that the physical principles which are involved are things that are very, very intuitive in many ways, and we are not talking about sophisticated physics. We're talking about simple physics with a lot of intelligence going into making sure that this physics becomes exploitable. And if you look at the surface of the plant, contrary to what instinct tells you, the surface of the plant is not smooth at all. We normally associate something which is easy to clean with a very smooth surface. The plants know better, so to speak. What they've done is simply to have the outermost cells extruding wax structures. The wax structures crystallize when they lose the solvent, and they create microstructures. So you got hierarchical structures of various kinds. So the blobs you see coming out are wax, nothing special. As a material, is pretty ordinary. The structure of the wax is pretty clever, okay, and that comes from controlling some of the chemistry and the physical chemistry of the process, which again the plant cells can do. And the result of that is really a piece of physics that a lot of us have done in school, which is surface tension. Increasing the complexity of the surface and the topography of the surface has two effects. The water, okay, cannot wet the surface because it hasn't got enough energy to do so, so it remains as a sphere, okay? And you can see that if you put a drop of water on a non-frying pan, it stays as a little bubble, okay? This is different. The frying pan is a chemical process. Here we're talking about purely a structural aspect. The second important effect is that if you have a very convoluted hairy surface, the contamination has only a few points of contact interacting with that surface. The result of that is that when the water touches the particles, energetically speaking, the particles prefer to go into the water because they've got a higher surface energy to deal with than to remain on the surface of the leaf. And the result of that, as shown there, is that the water runs off and the contamination runs off with the water. Okay? Well, I mean, it works, and it works very well, it's very effective, and more importantly, is actually very, very simple. So basically the schematic of the whole process is there. On the left you got the problem with a surface which is wettable, okay, a very smooth surface. The water will wet it, and the particles will have a strong interaction with the surface because of the surface area. On the right you have a hairy surface, the water cannot wet, and the particles cannot stick very firmly on the surface, and they prefer to go into the water. Very simple and very effective. Interestingly enough, the first product which was developed was designed for the building industry, because one of the biggest problems we have is cleaning the outside of buildings. And if you can coat the outside of buildings with this kind of product, which is now commercialized and called Lotus Leaf, okay, it's a paint, so again, completely different from the biological system in terms of material, but what it does is does the same thing as the wax being extruded. In other words, the chemistry of that particular paint is such that when the solvent evaporates, it creates a microstructure and a microtopography on the surface of the surface, and that has got the effect of wetting, non-wetting, as we've seen before. So this is on the top left is contamination on the surface of a masonry building, and has been used in tiles, roof tiles and whatever not. In fact, one of the most interesting examples that people are working on are photovoltaic solar collectors. In Spain, you got one of the biggest photovoltaic solar collectors in Europe. Okay, I don't know how many of you know how many people are employed to work 24 hours a day or most to keep them clean. Because the last thing you want, like the leaf, is to have contamination sitting on the surface of your photovoltaic. Your efficiency goes down like the drain, and if you don't have someone to go and wipe them off, they still don't function. So in a sense, this is a technology which is applicable to that kind of thing, and there are indeed people working on that thing. Having moved from concrete, you can treat the surface of wood, which is notorious for absorbing water, and yet there you are, this is a drop of water on the surface of wood. You can start using in textile fibers, which are microstructured in order to reproduce the same effect, and of course that leads to fabrics, which again can be decontaminated, okay? They normally are called self-cleaning, which is not really the right thing because they're not self-cleaning. It's just easy to clean as opposed to self-cleaning. But all these things are now beginning to move into the market. And one argues, okay, if we start talking about tall buildings, and there is a kind of obsession in architecture about bigger and bigger buildings, taller and taller buildings, well, someone has got to go and clean them at some point. And indeed, again, one can speculate, but this is what I said at the beginning. I'm not going to give you answers. I'm only going to give you some ideas that then you can translate yourself into useful answers if you want to. But certainly there is an advantage in having surfaces of these tall buildings coated with something which acts like the Lotus effect in order to be able to keep the building clean. Otherwise, they're going to spend a lot of money. There is another one, interesting one, which is to do with surfaces. And it's interesting because surfaces is something we often neglect, and yet the interaction between the external world and the internal world is happening at a surface. The surface is really the boundary between the inside and the outside. And yet, we in technology don't pay a lot of attention, whereas biology is really very careful. It knows very well that a lot of things are really controlled by that interaction with the surface. And this is an interesting project because, again, this is something which doesn't touch architecture directly, or didn't 10 years ago. Now, I don't know, you will see in a moment. This is the surface of the skin of a shark. And sharks have been around for 300, 400 million years. And they haven't changed much, okay? And the reason why they haven't changed much is, to some extent, the environment has not changed very much, okay? It's changing now, perhaps, with global warming, but for a large chunk of evolutionary scale, the water, seawater, wasn't very different. And of course, over the period of evolution, the optimization of the performance of the shark has moved on, and now it's pretty well at the top of the curve. It's difficult to see how it can get any better. The important thing about the shark is the fact that it hasn't got scales like other fish. It's got these platelets. I mean, there are scales, but not, they are a slightly different kind. In fact, these are ceramic scales and come out from the same organ which produces the teeth. The teeth are coming forward and the scales are going backwards. It's the same manufacturing process, which is fascinating as a multifunctional approach. Here you are, one day you create a tooth, and on the same chemistry, with the same process, you create a different structure for a different function. And these are very hard, and people in a lot of oceanic countries have used dried shark skin for sandpaper, okay, because they are very abrasive. I mean, the important thing is that the shark swims in that direction, and people have argued for a very long time whether that was simply a curiosity or there was some benefit in having this convoluted structure. Sharks have got one peculiarity compared to other fish. First of all, they don't have a swim bladder, which is a kind of balloon that fish can inflate with air to maintain neutral buoyancy. So a shark cannot maintain neutral buoyancy. If he stops swimming, he will sink. Okay? And being a predator and needing to feed, effectively a shark swims 24 hours a day throughout his life. Okay? So any little gain in efficiency of propulsion or reduction in drag, which is equivalent, is, of course, very important from survival. So biologists have speculated for a long time that that indeed was the function of these platelets. And then a bunch of aeronautical engineers in Berlin picked up the idea, verified that what the biologists felt was correct with computational techniques or physical models, whatever not. They were interested in airplanes, so they had to scale down the size of the platelets. And this is, again, one of these interesting examples where you have to change not only the material, but the scale. You're working, if you're moving an airplane in air with a different density from water, your scale has got to be different. So they replicated the equivalent, they simplified the design. There is no need for all the complexity of biology, which may have other functions as well that we don't know about, and simply produced a number of corrugations. Plastic film corrugation, easy to manufacture, and then they stuck these sheets on the fuselage of a couple of Airbuses, and then they've left these Airbuses flying around Europe, and then they compared the fuel efficiency of these Airbuses with the non-shark skin Airbuses, and they found that there was indeed an advantage in terms of fuel saving. Okay, small numbers do matter for airplanes. They consume a lot of fuel. They fly for 20 years of their life. Okay, so even small gains are important. Okay, so what's happened to all that? Well, the important message is the one at the bottom. Okay, that the Airbus A340, and in fact the Airbus A350, will have the surface of the wings textured in order to exploit the shark effect. So the next plane you're going to fly in 5 years' time, okay, will have something like that. So this time the difference is that instead of being a plastic coating attached to the surface, which has got problems because it's not very mechanically robust, is the fact that the texture that is needed to use the shark effect is actually going to be embedded into the surface of the material itself, which makes up the wing, which not surprisingly are composite materials. So these things is happening, and the substantial fuel saving is about 3%, which is huge for an air. And again, this is 1998, okay? So things in this case are progressing, but they are progressing relatively slowly. Okay, drag reduction. Now you start thinking, well, who cares about drag reduction in a building? So long as the building is up to about 20, 30, 40, 100 meters, you probably don't care. The moment your building is beginning to be 500, 600, 1 kilometer, the drag is beginning to be an important one, because the airflow at the top is completely different from what you have in a normal sized building, and there are all sorts of dynamic oscillation, vibration problems which are induced by the interaction between the fluid flow and the structure itself. So if you can reduce the drag, you can design the building so that it doesn't have the same problems with vibration and dynamics. So things, again, I'm not saying that this is being done, but certainly it's something that people working in these tall buildings have in their minds. Okay, I'll give another example, again, of something which, again, comes out of the blue and then suddenly finds an application unexpectedly. Okay, again, biologists have known that owls and the family of owls have got a very silent flight. In fact, it's the most silent, absolutely noiseless. And again, biologically speaking, one can understand that these things are hunting in the night, where you have very little noise in the environment. If you want to catch something, you don't want to alert it of your presence, and therefore, if you can fly without making a noise, that's to your advantage as a predator. So evolutionary speaking, again, this is what happened. If you go and look at what is that makes the flight of the owl silent, okay, again, it goes a little bit against the grain, because again, people are working in aerodynamics don't like to have floppy things normally, but as it happens, at the trailing edge of the feather, of the primary feathers on the wing, you have these little fluffy things which can move around. And these things are essentially acoustic absorbers, okay? They intercept the vibration of the sound and dampen it, okay? And so if you look at the structure of the feather, you can see this is the integral structure. These are all tightly connected together, Velcro type things as it happens, and then the ends are completely separated from each other so that they can move of their own accord. Okay, remember that the feather is not biologically connected to the animal anymore. Okay, there is no more interaction. The feather has been produced by the biology, but once it's been produced, it's dead. It's dead material, okay? The animal has no influence. So there is a kind of design process which goes back, and this is the phenotypic, genotypic thing, which says, look, if you're going to be an owl, you better have feathers working this way. Okay, so this is the biology, interesting, fascinating. You can see why sometimes it's difficult to disconnect from the biological world, but this guy has done it. One of the biggest problems that we have in trying to have wind turbines accepted in the UK is noise. They are noisy. There is no question that they are very noisy things. And in the Netherlands, where they are far further ahead in terms of use of wind turbines for energy production, okay, one of the things they've done is to try to moderate the effect of noise of wind turbines, make them more acceptable, okay, and what this chap has done is simply to introduce the equivalent of the end trailing edge floppy things at the end of the blade, and the function of that is precisely the same as the biological one, is to absorb energy, vibration energy, sound, and therefore make the blade run less noisily. Okay? Not a big, enormous challenge, but when you're talking about the difference from making that technology acceptable or not, okay, it really is important. And I'm sure that if people did not have the noise, they will accept wind turbines more easily than they would otherwise. So, just to cover a lot of ground in a very short time, unfortunately, I just wanted to highlight a little bit where biometics is relevant today and give you a couple more examples of that. Well, as I said, things are happening all over the place. And in order to get some kind of coherence in the presentation, I've put on the left different levels of structure at the biological end, and then on the right, application sectors, if you like, or technologies which relate to that specific link with the biology. So you've got a lot of stuff happening on the molecular side. And that's medicine, biotechnology, pharmaceutical, nanotechnologies, self-assembly, repair, surfaces. Okay, this is a long way from architecture, but already with the Lotus effect, you've seen how you can translate something on one scale to something useful on a different scale. Then you got the cell tissue, which is really the biological kind of core entity, which is to do with materials, textile, fibrous composites. All biological structures are fibrous. And again, we are beginning to see applications in architecture, energy management, metabolism, whatever not. And then you go to assembly of cells and tissue which form an organ where some of the functionality and the differentiation occurs at the same time. And again, this is really where you start thinking about smart material systems applied to architecture, actuators, artificial muscles, robotics, okay? And then you can go to the whole organism, of course, and we find the same thing on a different scale, okay? But perhaps the most important one is that when you start looking at an organism level, you can think of cities now as assemblies or equivalent assemblies of biological entities, which have got the same requirement: capture energy, minimize waste, survive changes in the environment, okay? So the challenge is exactly the same. So this is the biological molecular level, okay? All sorts of people are working in that. This is interesting because it's a cell tissue. This is vision in insects. And again, sometimes it's important to be able to think outside your own sort of traditional educational box. It really is important to move out of your comfort zone. These are the insects, compound eyes of insects, and these are there to intercept light. Okay, the fact that it's got many eyes as opposed to one is another issue. The point is that in order to do the job that it does, it needs to interact with light in a peculiar way. And these things are quite small, okay, 0.3 of a millimeter. And people have found that these structures do have some important properties in terms of low glare and reflectivity. And again, is not the material which is responsible, is the geometry and the scale of that geometry, okay? The biology, if you like, you can forget it, okay? Now you can make your structure with whatever material is appropriate, okay? And you will get the same benefit in the sense that the physics is going to be working for you exactly in the same way as it does for the insect. More spectacular is perhaps the question of physical colors, which again is something which is just beginning to touch in the architectural world and the engineering world. Those are feathers on the left, insects in the middle, and some marine animals on the right. None of these colors is due to chemistry, not a single one of them. All the colors come purely from the physical interaction between light, different wavelengths, and a structure inside the system itself. And the most beautiful examples of that are butterfly wings that people have worked on for about 10 years or so. First of all, to understand how it works. Secondly, to start thinking about moving into the technology application side. This butterfly has got a white wing with a black spot, okay? And the black spot is not a different chemical, it's exactly the same structure. The only difference between the white wing and the black spot is the structure you can see. The white thing has got this hierarchical structure where you got this, I'll point them out with these things here. This is the substructure, which is a polymer called chitin. And then in the white side, you got these little blobs. These are scattering light of all wavelengths. The result of that is white. White is the combination of all the colors together. So when all the colors are reflected, irrespective of wavelength, we see white. Okay? Conversely, if all the colors are absorbed, we see black. And this is the black. The black is exactly the same structure without the little blobs. And the dimensions of the structure are tuned to the wavelengths, or the range of wavelengths that you have to intercept. So there is a very smart kind of matching between light wavelength and dimension, typical dimension of the structure. And this is exactly the same way as all the other colors we've seen. One of the most fascinating things about that is that if one of these things is triggered to give a specific color, we can see greens and blues and reds and whatever. All these greens, blues and reds are exactly the same structure. The dimensions are slightly different for green, for red, and for blue. Which implies also that if we have a structure like that, and then we change the dimension of the structure, we change the color. So if it is red at one particular set of dimensions, we take it, we stretch it a bit, we can make it go blue or go red by compressing. And this is fascinating. It opens up a whole world of possible applications where physical colors are used, no chemistry involved. All that needs, which is not a simple answer, all that is needed is replicate structure of this kind at that scale. This is where scale, you can't get away from it. If it's going to work, it can only work at this scale. So there's no good making these things 10 times bigger, it's not going to work. So some of the things we have seen are scale independent. You can make them bigger or smaller and they will still work. Some of them are really very, very scale dependent and they can only work at that scale. We're talking about microns, okay? So it's small, but not sort of sub-micron level. And techniques such as rapid prototyping are beginning to get close to be able to replicate structures of that kind. With, again, the material doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the material is, so long as this pattern is there, the effect, the physics will be exploited. Okay, so the optical functions that we've seen are really to do with geometry, shape, form, all things that are also relevant in architecture. Then we got the other layers, which is the materials, the structures, the hierarchies, the various levels of organization, which again is something that architecture needs to move towards, because monolithic materials, a big block of cement is going to be a big block of cement no matter what you do, is never going to move away from that position. In order to exploit some of the processes that I mentioned, you really need to start moving into the hierarchical level of different types of organization. And this is what we've seen all along. I don't know how much time I've got left. Okay, since I'm talking about organisms as well, I found this one fascinating and I explain in the next slide why. This is a guy in Germany who has developed a very sophisticated computational tool for optimizing shape in engineering structures. And the way he has designed this tool was inspired by the growth of trees, branches attached to trunks, or forks in the tree, and the fork in the tree perhaps is a more spectacular example. Okay, so what he does is simply looked first of all at branches and realized that in biology, in the real world outside, and if you go and look at the shape of this fork junction between two parts of the trunk, that curve, you are not going to find it on any textbook. It is not an ellipse, it is not a parabola, it is not anything like that. The way that curve comes from is purely a process of growth and optimization of material deposition. In other words, the fabrication side is intimately related to the design performance side. What the tree does, as the tree grows, it puts material where it senses the stresses are highest. And it carries on doing that all along. So this is the non-optimized structure. This is the computational model, but people now can track down this in the real world. So it starts with a non-optimized structure. It calculates the maximum stresses due to the weight of this thing, and it finds, well, there's a high stress here, and there is a high stress here. So how do I minimize the stress? Well, in engineering, we do that as well, and we try to make the curve smoother and whatever not. We got textbooks which tell us all the shapes that we should be using, and they're all very geometrically precise shapes. Whereas this one comes out purely by replicating the process of growth. So what it does here, and only growth, you can't go back. Trees do not reabsorb materials. Bone can do it, can deposit material and reabsorb material, so it's a more dynamic system. Trees can only go one way. So what I'm saying is that the next amount of material is going to be preferentially deposited here, because this is where you go to high stress. And then you carry on with the same process. So this is the distribution of stresses in the unoptimized shape, and you got two peak stresses here and here, not surprised, which are the two red blobs here and here. And then in the middle, there's nothing here. And then this is the shape which comes out of the computational process, okay, by this pseudo growth of implemented in the code. And what you find is that all this region here is at the same stress. And if you think about an optimization process, you can't have it any better. Because if all that critical part is at the same stress, nothing is over-designed and nothing is under-designed either. Okay? So if you want to optimize the amount of material used, this is the way to go. And as I said, what is interesting is that this curve, okay, has no sort of traditional mathematical equivalent to. And different trees will not necessarily optimize themselves in the same shape. Depends on what happens. So this is a genetic type, growth type algorithm. And if you think for a moment, we are doing exactly the same thing in some of your computers. Okay, you start using genetic algorithm, evolutionary algorithm, neural networks. Okay, so these are biomimetic things. And whether you saw them like that or not, it doesn't matter. The point is that we are using information which has come from a biological world, translate it and transpose it into something which is useful for you in your technological world itself. And it's interesting because the switch from genetic algorithm, which is purely the genotype, whereas the evolutionary algorithms are more of the phenotypic type, has made a big, big difference in terms of the quality of the results that you get. Okay, and again, interestingly enough, people have looked at leaves for flow of liquids, and these are solar panels studied by the Fraunhofer Institute in Freiburg, and they wanted to optimize the shape of the channels which carried the water from one end to the other of the thing. And rather than, of course, they could approach that in a variety of ways, because Freiburg also has got that strong group on plant biomechanics and biomimetics. They talk to these people and they start looking at analogs where the problem is of the same kind, and big leaves have got exactly the same problem. If you want to move nutrients from where you get them and spread them out to the maximum surface area, okay, leaves do that quite well. And so they studied the leaves, the branching system, whatever not, and then they came up with a piece of computing code, okay, which uses some of the information extracted from the leaf in order to give you an optimized flow path for your liquid, okay? So, and what you come up is not obvious, okay? It's not something you're going to find in textbooks. It's the same kind of argument as the branching tree. You get shapes which just originate from the function itself, rather than being imposed arbitrarily by some kind of pseudo-knowledge or traditional knowledge, and sometimes is really ignorance rather than knowledge. Okay, so what are the reasons for success now that we've seen some of these things? Well, the mechanism that we mentioned before, of course, matter. Evolution, natural selection, time random mutations. What we see, of course, is what is survived. We don't see the bad designs, they've gone. Okay, there have been a lot of bad designs as well. Nature is far from being perfect. Certainly, in order to be able to create the functionality and the smartness, you need the right materials, the right structures, you need to integrate sensors, not always, but very often, and you need a very, very high level of integration between these various functions. And of course, at the end of the day, like a biological system, you want to be efficient in the use of energy. And we are not particularly good, and it was interesting talking to your colleagues here, Iaac, over coffee just before the talk. There is a fundamental difference. Okay, we are grumbling about the fact that sort of wind power, solar power, tidal power is fluctuating, is not steady, and people don't like that. Okay, in our world we like things to be, you know, we want 50 and it's got to be 50, not 25 one day and 75 the next day, which averages to 50, but that's not the point. And the problem is that our technology, traditionally, is not designed to capture diffuse sources of energy. Our technology is designed to capture very highly concentrated sources of energy. So the moment we are faced with having to grab energy from wind, from sun, or tidal waves, or whatever not, we don't have the right technology in hand, okay? Or at least we are beginning to develop the right technology. So that's one problem. The second problem, which is often forgotten, is that in biology, the energy you capture, you use it in situ. You don't have cables transmitting energy from plant A to plant B, or from animal A to animal B. The energy captured is used where it's captured. And of course, this has got to be more efficient than capturing energy here and then moving it 1,000 kilometers away from a power station to somewhere else. The losses are astronomical. In fact, if you look at the numbers, you know, it's mind-boggling. So, in order to make the best possible use of fluctuating energy sources, it's much better to develop technologies, including architectural, social, whatever, which actually can make use of that energy in situ, not shifting it away. Storage is another problem. Okay, we don't know how to store energy. Okay, we are very inefficient. Okay, I know we got batteries, but you know, keep your computer alive for 2 hours and then gone. Plants, animals have got all sorts of mechanisms for storing energy when you got excess energy. Plants, you convert the energy in the first place. You never use the energy as it is. You always convert it into starches, which is food. Effectively, you convert it into chemical energy, and then you use it throughout the year as you may need it. So you got a storage device. Animals, of course, fat and other parts of the body are designed to store energy. So these things can only survive because they capture directly or indirectly the energy, and also because they can store it. And storage of energy is one of the biggest challenges. So we need to understand a bit more about how these things work. So, as I said, in biology, one of the tricks is to use these fibrous materials to give you a much bigger range of shapes. And again, because I don't want to overrun too much, and if people want more detail, I'm more than happy to provide them. But there are really two fundamental aspects in biological systems. One is that you got a lot of differentiation, which you make all the material level. We've got anisotropy, which is directionality of properties coming from bundle of fibers, okay, whether it's animal tissues or plant tissues. You've got a lot of heterogeneity. You've seen it already, different scales of structure organized in different ways. And then you've got the hierarchies, which come up also in play in order to be able to give you some emergent behavior in the system. Basically, all these things together, okay, really are the things that need to be integrated at the structural or component level in order to be able to exploit the thing. Nothing does it better than trees, where in the same plant, same organism. You've got solar energy collectors in the leaves. You've got a self-supporting structure, the trunk. You've got motor movement. This is a big challenge. How do you move motor 100 meters from the root to the top without a pump? And yet that's what the tree does all the time. And I'm not talking about milliliters of water going from there to there. I'm talking about hundreds of liters. Okay? And if you take the tropical forest in Brazil or other parts of the world and you look at it at dawn and you see it's covered in mist, that's not mist. This is all transpiration from the plants. This is all water which has moved from the ground, the root system, up to the leaves at the top of the tree. Typically 40 meters, in exceptional cases 100 meters. Okay, so how does that work? I mean, we are beginning to see how it works. Can we use the technology? Well, it would be interesting to know. Because remember the tall buildings we talked about before. If you want your toilets running properly when you are on the 150th floor, which is 1 kilometer above ground, you got to have a system which pumps the water up there. Okay? And you got to have a reliable system as well. This thing works all the time. So, water movement, sensing, as I said, shape optimization due to phototropism, gravitropism. Again, I don't have time to go into it, but shape adaptation is an important thing in order to be able to exploit the environment. And then we come back to seeds, because I just want to show you how simple things can be if you get it right. This is a pine cone. The function of that is like the hairy seed we saw before. It's got to open up and disperse the seeds. How it does open up is relatively simple once you understand a bit about how wood works. Okay, you've got cellulose, 2 layers of cells made of cellulose. Cellulose is hygroscopic, but the matrix, the glue into which the cellulose fibers are embedded, is even more hygroscopic. So the result of that is when this thing dries out, it loses water. And the loss of water forces the thing to shrink. This is what any kind of piece of biological tissue, whatever the origin is, if you dry it out, it will shrink. Okay? If you got only 1 layer of material, it will shrink in its own plane and nothing much is going to happen. If you got 2 layers and you design the thing so that one shrinks more than the other, you get curvature. And this is exactly what the bracts of the pine cone do. When they dry out, if you look at the structure inside here, you find 2 layers. One of them has got cells like these with cellulose fibers oriented this way, which essentially means in that direction here. Okay? And then you got a second layer with the cells, same size, same dimension, but the cellulose fibers are oriented that way. So you got 2 layers, one of fibers going this way, one of fibers going that way. This one shrinks more than this one, and the whole thing is going to curve. So easy, okay, if you get the right materials, if you get the right structure, and indeed we have done, so the mechanism is purely a differential shrinkage between 2 layers. We see examples of that in all sorts of seed pods of various kinds, bending, splitting, twisting. Okay, all of them based on the same mechanism. The difference comes from the organization of the tissues or the organization of the fibers. And again, fibers can give you much bigger design space. So this one is an African one. You can see that it's bending when it's open. This is something which twists. Oh, sorry. Well, you can see that this one twists, the other one bends. And this is something you can experience yourself in the summer. If you go to a field of these things, you can touch the tip and suddenly these things will explode. The explosion is energy stored in the system and is designed again to do exactly the same function as the others. In other words, to make sure that the seeds are propelled as far away from the parent plant. So there is a lot. This is very simple. Once you understand the basic mechanism and once you understand the 2 or 3 physical engineering principles, material science principles behind. You cannot get it unless you've got fibers, though. That's axiomatic. And years ago, we developed a smart textile, which is based on the pine cone. Okay, and again, the scale is different, the materials are different, the mechanism is of the same kind. 2 layers, one absorbs water or loses water very quickly, the other one does nothing, is neutral. and therefore you couple them together and it's got a curve. The advantage of this compared to the pine cone is that this thing can react very quickly because it's very thin. The pine cone takes a long time to dry out because it's quite a chunky kind of thing. So scale is relevant, but not in the sense of limiting the effect, but simply manipulating the magnitude of the effect. And indeed, this thing apparently has been used, same kind of technology has been used to design some adaptive clothing, which does exactly the same thing. Oops. And on a different scale, and when you had Achim, he may have shown the hygroscope, and he's now got another pavilion, which is based on the same thing. The one on the top is not the hygroscope, that's called a hygromorph, but is essentially a manifestation of the same principle. In other words, if you have a material which is reacting to water, okay, not in a homogeneous manner, but by layering and using appropriate tricks, fiber orientation, thickness, whatever not, you can make the thing change shape quite significantly once it's absorbed or loses water. And then the hygroscope in Paris at the Centre Pompidou, which the flaps here are essentially the equivalent of your pine cone. Nothing more, nothing less. The geometry is different, the scale is different, the material is not quite that different, it's wood, same thing, but by playing around with the orientation of the grain, you can get exactly the same effect. So these things react to humidity, and when the humidity increases, it opens up. And of course, if you want a smart system, look at the humidity level in this room, okay? If we want to expel the humidity, either we have to use an air conditioner, which means having an input of energy in addition to use, or we have to have something equivalent to that, so that when the humidity level reaches a given level, it's open, and we can dispose of the excess moisture. Okay, so all sorts of things are possible, and yet another example of how to think about it. Okay, I don't know how many of you are aware of the building on the right, which is the kinetic thing at the Expo 2012 in Korea. And I don't know how many of you are aware of the fact that the connection between that thing and that thing is that flower over there. And to me, this is another beautiful example of how to think in biomimetics terms. These people, the group of people who developed, not up to here, but the intermediate step, were a group of young researchers who actually got the Biocon International Prize last year, okay, and we had something like 50 submissions, and there was judged to be the best one. And one of the reasons why it is the best one is because of the way of thinking again. They started with the biology, curiosity. They, again, finding the right people to point you in the right direction. Okay, the animal which pollinates this flower, the Strelitzia, is not an insect. Plants have evolved all sorts of interesting interaction with insects, shape interaction, mechanical interaction, vibration interactions. Okay, this plant has decided that instead of interacting with insects, it will interact with birds. So the pollinator is a bird. And now you have the problem to make sure that when the bird arrives, you make the pollen accessible to the bird, but you don't want the pollen to be accessible to other animals like insects. So how do you filter out your birds from your insects? Well, the way evolution has worked here is really to design this organ, which is made of two membranes, which are essentially closed over the organs which carry the pollen. When the bird wants to feed, it perches here at the tip of the thing, which is a beam, so the weight of the bird makes the whole thing flex, and the flexure of the main beam induces an opening of the membranes. There are no computers there, okay? Everything is done in an entirely passive way. So, of course, if you got an insect trying the same trick, it's not going to work, because the bird is tens, if not hundreds of times more massive than the insect. So the insect cannot get in because the access will be prevented. Very, very interesting. Okay, what is interesting also is that those people who did the measurements on the plant, sometimes we think plants as delicate objects, this thing can open and close more than 1,000 times without breaking. Okay, so it's not trivial. If you think about the amount of material used is nothing, the type of material used is pedestrian, everything is just in the design, in the detail. Anyway, the idea was to take that idea and start turning into some concept, okay, and the most important one was the coupling between the bending of the main beam and the opening of the membrane, which essentially involves a rotation. So they started doing some finite elements, computational side, physical experiments, whatever not, and they satisfied themselves that indeed they could get something of the same kind. So fine. Now what comes next is interesting because this is where they've been very smart in forgetting about the biology at the right time, okay? So what they said, okay, if we got something that if we can induce a bending, we can get it to rotate, maybe we can use that to make some kind of shading device. Here comes the architecture. So the idea is to have an array of these things, okay? Of course, something has got to bend them, okay? You don't have birds perching on top of them, but it's not a big problem, mechanically speaking, to have some material like rubber, which can react to heat by contracting, and you use the contraction to force the beam to bend, the beam bends, and the flap rotates. So again, this is purely a modeling demonstration of the thing, but now you can begin to see how the logic works. Okay, so the flower now is forgotten, the right materials are completely different, the scale of the thing is completely different, the function is completely different. Okay, it doesn't matter. The idea came from an organism in biology. So that's how the thing, actually the physical prototype, okay, so this is in position 1, then you apply heat, the rubber springs contract, the contraction forces the bending forces the rotation of the flaps. And the same kind of thing was then used in a kind of conceptual way to design this kinetic thing in the expo. So again, this is no sensors, okay? The integration is so high that the sensor and the actuator are the same thing, okay? So you have closed the loop completely and you don't need computers. I'm not saying that that is always going to work, but if you can make it to work without computers, you save yourself an awful lot of hassle because you increase the level of effectiveness of the system, you minimize the cost, you got effectively a high level of redundancy in the system itself because your structure is your computer, so to speak, okay? You don't have reliability issues, so there are all sorts of advantages in going from a non-IT based type situation. And again, very quickly, because I don't have anything specific to show other than to tell you that there are people working in similar systems, okay? We got in plants again, we got the stomata cells which are controlling the transpiration. These are active systems now as opposed to passive systems. In the sense you have to have a pressure inside the cell and the geometry of the cell to manipulate the shape. The shape manipulation is what you want to achieve because by changing the shape of the cells, you can make these things open or close. So these are valves, essentially, which the plant uses to control transpiration. When it doesn't want to transpire, the valves are closed. When it wants to expel additional water, the valves are open. This works again on the level of a few millimeters, but there is no reason whatsoever, and in fact there are a few examples where we can make this thing work on a bigger level. The same kind of trick is done in a different scale, but a different arrangement with Mimosa pudica. This is what is called a touch-sensitive plant. If you touch one of the leaves, there is not only the leaf itself which has been touched collapses, falls down because of gravity, but then the message is transmitted to the neighboring leaves and the whole thing goes into a closed configuration. Again, the biological reason for that is easy to understand. if you got an insect attacking the plant and you want the plant to protect itself, the best thing it can do is to fall down and close up. But also, if you want to preserve your neighbors, you have to send information to the neighboring plants. We don't really know exactly what the information type is, partly mechanical, partly electrical, but information transfer is there very clearly. Remember that all these systems are reversible, and the only way you can generate the reversibility is really by manipulating the pressure inside the cells. The cells are bags full of pressure, hydraulic pressure. So if you release the pressure, certain changes in geometry occur. If you increase the pressure, other changes in geometry occur. So the stomata cells work by increasing the pressure. That forces the cell to change shape and to open. The Mimosa pudica works in the reverse way. It works by having cells which at the base of the leaves lose pressure, and as the pressure is lost, the structural function is lost, and the leaf simply collapses under its own weight. And similar things happen here in the Venus flytrap, which is again a pressure-driven system. This is one of the carnivorous plants, which again has developed a range of motions designed to capture energy, essentially. And then you have the leaves and the folding, unfolding. And this is quite interesting because when leaves open up, essentially the structure is already folded inside. There are some very interesting folding techniques for packaging the maximum amount of material with the minimum amount of volume. As soon as the bud opens, this thing has got to explode, so to speak. It's got to increase in surface area as much as possible because it wants to capture sunlight before competition comes in. So it's got to deploy a minimum level of surface area without growth, and then it adds to that by having growth. So there are some interesting dynamic and temporal sequences in looking at some of these things, which are, for the moment, way beyond our understanding. The last topic, very briefly, is having started with hydraulic systems, okay, again, is something that we sometimes forget how effective hydraulic pressure is. And lots of animals, as well as plants, as we've seen, use hydraulic pressure to achieve structural integrity. The shark is an example in point. The stiffness of the body of the shark does not come from a skeleton. It doesn't have one. The shark is all collagen in a kind of jelly-like thing. The only way it can achieve the rigidity, the structural rigidity that it needs in order to swim, is to have muscles, and the muscles are trying to compress the water. Water is incompressible, and the mechanical consequence of that incompressibility as you increase the rigidity of the system. So that's what the shark does, and the other kind of tunicates, what they do is to change their shape, okay, in order to have propulsion, whatever not. All these things are manipulated by families of fibers in various directions, muscles acting in various directions, and the most important constituent, liquid water. We are not good at using water other than for drinking or washing or watering, okay? Biology uses water as a part, integral part of the structural effectiveness of its designs. And one of the best things to show that is the octopus. I was involved in this project, which just finished. And the idea there was to look at the tentacles of the octopus. And the reason for that was to do with application in robotics. So forget about that for a moment. What is interesting about the arm or tentacle of the octopus is the fact that it can organize itself in virtually an infinite number of shapes. Okay, if you take a traditional robot, because of the rigid links, the limited number of configurations are possible. Okay, here one single tentacle has got an infinite number of configurations, and in fact, because you got 8 tentacles, you got 8 times infinity possibilities at your disposal. You know, this is huge. Okay, not surprisingly, people are desperately trying to replicate some of the functionality of the thing, because having a robot which is not limited as much as the current technology to specified shapes by the geometry and the mechanics of the driving system is fascinating. The way it works is even more fascinating. Okay, the tentacle, the arm, is simply a tube full of gel which is full of water and fibers which are collagen, that's the skin and part of the thing. And then you got muscles, and you got muscles organized in different orientations. Essentially, you got muscles acting in this direction along the length of the tentacle. You got muscles acting in this direction circumferentially or radially, and then you got muscles acting at plus or minus 45. And depending on which muscles the octopus actuates, it can do almost anything you want. If you want to bend the arm, you actuate the longitudinal muscles on one side but not on the other. It's going to force to bend like that. If you want to increase in length, remember muscles work only by contracting. There are no muscles which can extend. So you need to convert a contraction into an extension, and this is where the water comes in. If you take a tube full of water and you decrease the diameter of the tube, and you have a constant volume of water because water is incompressible, then if you can exert sufficient force, the tube is going to get longer. This is exactly how the octopus makes the tentacle shorter or longer. So you can combine bending with extension, and then by using the plus minus 45 muscles, you can have the rotation as well, plus or minus. So the interesting thing, of course, is the octopus can actuate this muscle selectively, depending on what it wants to do. But what is the most important thing, to me the most fascinating things, is the fact that if you use all the muscles simultaneously, the system locks up and becomes almost infinitely rigid. Because in order for the water to be compressed, you have to provide so much energy that the system goes from floppy to completely rigid. Okay? Just at the flick of a button, more or less. Having structures where you can vary the stiffness are of immense importance in a number of applications in engineering, but also in other aspects where if you want to change a shape, you don't change it with a rigid configuration. You make the configuration go soft, you change the shape, and then you lock it back into whatever is the new configuration. So by having this kind of system, and remember, the water is an integral part. Without water, that system will not be able to work. Okay, we can't do it, and we have only to go back to our traditional mechanics. Okay, these are the actuators for the muscles. I'm not going to spend any time on that. All this information is on the website if people are interested. So thank you for your patience, and we come to the end. Okay, I think there are a number of messages, okay, and again, they are not specific answers, but they are really ways of thinking. First of all, remember inspiration, not imitation. This is crucial. Otherwise, you're going to get stuck in a hole and then decide that the system does not work, okay? So remember to abstract and then use your process, your scale, your material system in order to implement not necessarily all the battery of functions, but at least the one which is the critical one for your purposes. As you've seen, all these designs are highly integrated. You don't have things which we call a material, and then these are turned into a structure, and then they are turned into a function. Everything is blended together. It's almost impossible, in fact, to separate what you call function, structure, material. And if you want to then achieve this high level of integration, then multidisciplinary approaches are important. You need people with skills in computing, in structures, in materials, in biology, etc., etc., in sensors, whatever. The materials are very simple. In fact, there are three basic materials, well, four. Water is one, sugars, cellulose is two, proteins is three, ceramics, basic simple ceramics like your bones is four. That's it. The whole of biology, okay, well, insects have got chitin, which is similar to cellulose. The whole of biology has been built over 500 million years with just 5 bits of material. The range of opportunities has come up not from the materials themselves, but from the organization of those materials, which itself is related to the fact that fibers can be organized in millions of different geometrical patterns. So these complex structures, which come up from simple materials, stepping stone is the fibers, then your complex structures, all these things are designed to give you this adaptive, multifunctional, smart solutions. And at the bottom is again what I mentioned before, the physical principles are often, I'm not saying they're always, but they are very often. There isn't a single example of what I've come across in 20 years that I couldn't explain on a piece of paper, okay, with very, very simple physics. Because the secret is not in the physical principles, the physics is here. Is the complexity of the structure which leads to the function by exploiting the right physics at the right level. So, as you can see, plants can adapt very easily. This is a beautiful example. Of course, if you got soil between the bricks, then you just go between the bricks. And what it shows is not just nice things, is the fact that there are a lot of very clever sensing functions. There are touching functions, there are water sensing functions. So the roots themselves are very active as a system. In order to find their way, is not a blind thing growing at random, is growing in response in certain directions at certain rates in response to signals which come from the environment. Yet again, this interaction with the environment is absolutely vital to understanding what is going on. And so some time ago I came across this piece of text from Proust, okay, which is really quite nice because he says the real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but really having new eyes. In other words, what we need to do is to look what is under our own noses, okay, perhaps with a different eye, indeed, and try to use that information and then move on into our own fields of interest. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and if you got any questions, of course, now, some of the students tomorrow morning, because I'll be around tomorrow until lunchtime at least, if not beyond. So some of these things may take a little bit of thinking before you can ask a question. But if there are any questions now, I'll be more than happy, if I can, to answer them. Yeah.
So I will get the opportunity. But it's quite inspiring, and thank you very much for your conference. It's always very interesting to see the different applications by extracting logics from natural, from living organisms, from biological, let's say, entities. At some moment in your conference, you were making this analogy of the different scales of an organism with different kind of architectural scales, and you were speaking about the organism as a possible analogy with a city. So we are working a lot here at Iaac with the ideas of the smart cities, and we're working a lot with the idea of trying to convert cities into an organism with a central brain and a nervous sensor system that is able to transform the city into an organism that performs biological functions, such as, for example, filtering water, like the kidney system, or recycling waste as the digestive system in a way, no? Or tracking elements or people as the visual system. But we're doing so implementing technology. we are doing so by using sensors and actuators and mechanical means, in a way. And there is a big debate and an interesting question of whether much of what you have been showing today could be applied in a more passive way, in a more passive systems, rather than all this technological, let's say.
Well, I agree, and this is really why I think that it's tempting, and I can understand why. You said yourself, a central brain. Okay, you can look at a lot of the examples I've given you which have no brain, central or not central, and yet they've got the whole battery of sensing functions that you want. And not only that, but remember that one big difference between the plant world and the animal world is indeed, in the animal world, you've got a lot of specialization of cells, okay? You've got blood vessels, and you've got blood cells, and you've got kidneys, and you've got whatever not. They obviously have specialized in different functions. In plants, all the cells are capable of doing all the functions. At any given time, they will do one function. But if you force them, they will switch. And the example of that is when you take a cutting from a plant which has no roots, you put it in the ground, and then you wait 2 weeks, and you get roots. The roots are not coming from nothing. The roots are coming simply from the cells which were part of non-plant, non-root material, which now get a different environment, and they respond to the difference in the environment by saying, I need to become a root cell. So to me, there is something which, and all the systems of plants tend to be more passive because they don't have the, as I said, I think the two can coexist. The advantage of the non-central brain is the fact that if you take all the higher organisms with a brain, if you chop their brains off, nothing works. Even in insects, which are certainly more advanced neurologically than a plant, actually the functions are all distributed. So if you take one of these insects and you cut it in half, okay, each half can carry on doing 90% of its functions by itself. The octopus is yet another example. All the information, the brain of the octopus, 80% of the brain of the octopus is used for vision. That's one of the most important senses for the octopus, to find prey, of course, which means that all the other things need to find a different way of doing it. So all the response of the arms, the touch sensors, the change of shape is not controlled by the central brain. It's controlled peripherally by having a closed loop system, which is designed to say, look, this is the input, this is what I'm going to have to do, okay? Bypassing the brain. And bypassing the brain, to me, has got the advantage. As I said, you cannot achieve without a brain the higher functions, but you can achieve a lot more reliability because you don't have this problem. So I think it's not a question of saying either one or the other. I think both have got sort of something to offer in life. The passive system, certainly, the passive system has the advantage that they can use energy directly from the environment. The active system, the brain control system, can't, because the brain itself needs so much energy to function that you don't have the same ability. So these are some of the differences anyway. Sorry. For me or someone else.
Any other questions for George? They're a bit shy.
Don't worry. I mean, I understand. There's a lot of information packaged in a very short time.
We would welcome you to stay for a while.
Yeah.
Have a drink.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Students can come like more in
Yeah.
way to a discussion.
That's fine.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.